My jealous mother destroyed the wedding dress my grandmother had saved for 55 years, just because my grandmother wanted to give it to me for my wedding instead of my sister. I've lived in my older sister's shadow for as long as I can remember. And honestly, I stopped fighting it somewhere around middle school, when I realized that no amount of achievement or effort would ever make me visible to my mother. My name is Kate, I'm 28 years old, and for most of my life, I've been the overlooked daughter in a family where only one person seemed to matter, and that person was never me. My sister is 3 years older than me, and from the moment she could walk, she became my mother's entire world. Every achievement, every outfit, every mediocre accomplishment was celebrated like she'd discovered the cure for cancer, won the lottery, and solved world hunger all at once. Meanwhile, I could bring home straight A's and get a distracted nod while Mom gushed over my sister's C- in art class. I remember being 12 years old, coming home with an award for highest grades in my entire grade, and my mother glanced at the certificate for about 3 seconds before turning back to my sister to discuss what dress she wanted for some dance at school. That was the moment I understood that nothing I did would ever be enough, because the problem wasn't my accomplishments. It was me. My father left when I was 5 years old. I have fragmented memories of him, the smell of his aftershave, the way he'd lift me up and spin me around in the living room, the sound of his laugh when I'd tell him some nonsensical story about my imaginary friend. But mostly, I remember the end. I remember my parents screaming at each other behind closed doors, their voices shaking the walls of our small house. I remember my mother crying in the bathroom for hours while my sister and I sat outside the door, not understanding what was happening but knowing it was bad. I remember the morning he left, how he packed a suitcase before dawn and kissed my forehead while I pretended to be asleep. He whispered, "I'm sorry, Katie," and then he was gone. He didn't take me with him. He didn't fight for custody. He just disappeared into wherever fathers go when they decide fatherhood is too hard, and I never saw him again. No birthday cards, no phone calls, no child support checks, just absolute absence. After he vanished, my mother collapsed in on herself and decided that working was beneath her dignity, that she'd suffered enough loss and trauma to justify never contributing to her own survival again. That someone else was my grandmother on my mother's side, a woman who worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years and saved every penny she didn't absolutely need to spend. Every single month, like clockwork, my grandmother sent money to cover rent, groceries, utilities, everything. The house we lived in actually belonged to her. She'd bought it decades ago as an investment property and let us live there rent-free out of love and obligation to her daughter. My grandmother paid the electric bill, the water bill, the internet, the cable, the phone bill, literally every expense that came through the door. She sent a check for $2,000 every month for living expenses, which my mother would spend on whatever she wanted without ever accounting for how the money disappeared. My mother contributed absolutely nothing except complaints about how the house was too small, the neighborhood wasn't nice enough, and how hard her life had become after my father abandoned us. She wore her victimhood like armor and used it to justify never doing anything productive for 23 years. My sister graduated with a fashion design degree 10 years ago from an expensive private art school that my grandmother paid for in full, including room and board, supplies, and a generous monthly allowance for inspiration and networking. She's never worked a single day in that field. She's been waiting for the right opportunity, which apparently means sitting on the couch scrolling through social media for a decade, while my grandmother's money pays for her existence. She'd occasionally talk about starting her own boutique or launching a clothing line, elaborate fantasies that never progressed past doodling designs in a notebook that she'd abandon after a week. My mother enabled every excuse, telling her that her talent was too special to waste on entry-level positions or internships, that she deserved to start at the top. So my sister waited and continued waiting while living off money she didn't earn and contributing nothing to the world except her presence. I took a completely different path because I watched my mother and sister's lifestyle and knew with absolute certainty that I never wanted to be like them. I started working at 18, the summer before I started college, taking a position at a chain restaurant as a server. The work was exhausting, standing for 8-hour shifts, dealing with rude customers who thought I was beneath them, carrying heavy trays until my arms ached. But it was mine. The money I earned belonged to me, and nobody could use it as leverage or hold it over my head. I went to a public university and studied business administration, taking out minimal student loans and working 25 hours a week the entire time I was in school. I'd see my sister sleeping until noon on weekdays while I was getting up at 5 in the morning to study before my shift started. When I graduated, I applied to 57 companies before I finally got a job offer as an administrative coordinator at a mid-sized logistics company. The pay was decent. Not amazing, but $38,000 a year felt like a fortune after years of counting every penny. It was enough to feel independent, enough to rent my own apartment, enough to feel like I was building something that belonged to me and couldn't be taken away by someone else's mood or whim. The comparisons never stopped, not for one single day of my childhood or young adulthood. Every single family dinner, every holiday gathering, every random Tuesday when I'd stop by the house to drop something off, I heard about how talented my sister was, how creative, how she just needed the right break, and then everyone would see her genius. My mother would talk about my sister's artistic vision, while I sat there in my work clothes after a 10-hour day, completely ignored. When I got promoted to senior coordinator, my mother's response was, "That's nice." And then she immediately pivoted to talking about my sister's idea for a vintage-inspired clothing line that would never materialize. When I bought my first car with my own money, my mother said it was too practical and boring. When my sister talked about maybe getting a car someday when she found the right one, my mother spent an hour showing her pictures of luxury vehicles she couldn't afford and would never buy. I learned to stop sharing my accomplishments because the deflation that followed wasn't worth the brief hope that maybe this time would be different. The only person who ever saw me, who ever treated my achievements like they mattered, was my grandmother. I visited her every single week, sometimes twice a week, and those visits became my sanctuary, my therapy, my proof that I wasn't crazy for feeling hurt by my mother's indifference. She'd make tea, the same brand she'd been buying for 30 years, served in delicate cups with tiny flowers painted on them. We'd sit in her kitchen with the yellow wallpaper that she refused to update because my grandfather had hung it the year they bought the house. And she'd ask me real questions about my life. How was work? Was I making friends? What was I reading? What were my goals? She'd listen to my answers like they were the most important things she'd heard all week. She'd tell me she was proud of me, that my independence and work ethic mattered more than any designer degree collecting dust on a wall. She'd slip me a $20 bill when I wasn't looking and tell me to treat myself to something nice. Those afternoons kept me sane through years of being dismissed and overlooked, like I was just background noise in a story about my sister's potential. About a year and a half ago, I met someone at a work conference in Chicago that my company sent me to for professional development. Her name doesn't matter for this story, but what matters is that she saw me the way my grandmother did, as a whole person worth knowing, not as the disappointing daughter or the shadow sister. She worked as a civil engineer for a mid-sized construction company, and we started talking during a lunch break about how terrible the hotel coffee was. We were both standing in line at the conference center cafe, and she made some sarcastic comment about how they managed to make coffee taste like both burnt rubber and dirty water simultaneously. I laughed, actually laughed, and we ended up sitting together for the lunch session and the afternoon workshops. We exchanged numbers, started texting, and within a month we were driving 2 hours each way every weekend to see each other. 6 months after that first conversation about terrible coffee, she got a job transfer to my city, and we moved in together almost immediately. It felt fast, but also like it had been inevitable from that first conversation. We found a small apartment downtown, 3rd floor of a building with creaky stairs and thin walls, splitting rent and cooking terrible dinners and laughing at stupid things on TV. She'd come home from construction sites covered in dust, and I'd come home from the office with tension headaches from staring at spreadsheets for 9 hours, and we'd collapse on our beat-up couch and talk about everything and nothing. It felt like finally someone chose me first. Not as a backup option or an afterthought or the less interesting alternative. She wanted to hear about my day. She cared when I was stressed. She celebrated my small wins like they were major victories. After 27 years, I felt like somebody's first choice, and the feeling was intoxicating. One night in late March, we were sitting on our beat-up second-hand couch eating takeout Chinese food straight from the containers because neither of us felt like doing dishes. We'd both had long weeks. She was dealing with a difficult contractor on one of her projects, and I was managing a system transition at work that was going badly. We were half watching some crime show on TV, not really paying attention, just existing in the same space in that comfortable way that happens when you're with someone who feels like home. Then she got up, said she needed to grab something from the bedroom, and came back holding a small navy blue box. She didn't get down on one knee or make some elaborate speech. She just sat down next to me, opened the box, and said, "I want to spend my life with you, and I'm tired of waiting to make it official. Will you marry me?" The ring was simple, nothing extravagant, just a silver band with a small, clear stone that caught the light from our one good lamp. It was perfect. It was us. Practical. Meaningful. without unnecessary flash or pretense. I said yes before she finished the sentence, and we sat there crying and laughing and spilling rice and orange chicken on the floor because neither of us could hold our containers steady anymore. We stayed up until 3 in the morning making plans, talking about what kind of wedding we wanted, where we'd live long term, whether we wanted kids, all the big conversations we'd been dancing around for months. For the first time in my life, I was planning a future that was entirely mine, with someone who wanted to build that future with me as an equal partner. I felt like I was glowing from the inside out. I told my mother and sister the next day, driving to the house, my grandmother's house, though they acted like it was theirs and they'd somehow earned the right to live there, on a Saturday morning when I knew they'd both be home. I walked into the living room where they were both watching some reality show about rich people screaming at each other in expensive restaurants, which seemed fitting given their own delusions about their lifestyle and importance. I held up my left hand, the ring catching the morning light coming through the windows, and said, "We're engaged. She proposed last night." My mother glanced at the ring for approximately 2 seconds, not even bothering to pause the TV, and said, "Oh, that's a small stone. Are you sure she can afford to get married if she could only buy that?" The words hit me like a slap, but before I could respond, my sister laughed. Actually laughed like I'd told the funniest joke she'd heard all year. She said, "When I get married, my ring is going to be at least 2 carats, maybe 3. And my wedding is going to be incredible, like something out of a magazine. People will be talking about it for years." My mother nodded enthusiastically, setting down her coffee mug to give my sister her full attention, which she'd never given me. She said, "Your sister's wedding will be the event of the decade. We'll rent one of those historic mansions, hire the best caterers, get a designer to make her dress custom. It'll be absolutely spectacular." I stood there holding up my hand like an idiot while they discussed my sister's hypothetical wedding, feeling my excitement drain away into that familiar, hollow feeling I'd carried my entire childhood, like a stone in my chest. The joy from the night before evaporated, replaced by the old familiar ache of being overlooked in my own family. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and left. Drove straight to my grandmother's house even though it was 9 in the morning on a Saturday, and I hadn't called ahead. I knocked on her door, and she opened it in her bathrobe and reading glasses, a book in her hand, and took one look at my face and pulled me inside immediately without asking questions. When I showed her the ring, she cried. Actually cried, tears running down her face. She grabbed my hand and examined the ring like it was the most precious object she'd ever seen, turning it in the light, exclaiming over the way the stone was cut. The delicate band. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe and kept saying, "My beautiful girl, I'm so happy for you. This is wonderful. Tell me everything." We sat in her kitchen for 3 hours talking about wedding plans, about my fiancé, about how we met and fell in love. She made tea and cookies, and she listened to every single detail like it was the most fascinating story she'd ever heard. She asked about our timeline, our budget, what kind of ceremony we wanted. When I mentioned that we were thinking about something vintage-inspired, something classic and elegant but not too formal, her entire face lit up. That's when she told me about the dress. She disappeared into her bedroom and came back carrying a garment bag I'd never seen before. Inside was her wedding dress from 55 years ago. It was this beautiful vintage piece, cream-colored lace with delicate details and a classic 60s silhouette. She held it up and said, "I've been saving this for someone special. I think it was always meant to be yours." I tried it on right there in her living room, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made specifically for my body, which felt impossible but true. Standing in front of her mirror wearing that dress, I felt like I finally mattered, like I was finally the one who got something precious and irreplaceable. My grandmother insisted on contributing money for the wedding. She wrote me a check that made my hands shake, and combined with what my fiancé and I had saved, we could afford a small but beautiful ceremony. Nothing extravagant, just a simple venue. Good food, a photographer, a string quartet for the ceremony, and a DJ for the reception. We booked a place with tall windows and hardwood floors, the kind of space that looks elegant without trying too hard. I ordered flowers, lots of white roses and eucalyptus. I picked out decorations that felt classic and timeless. Everything was coming together exactly how I wanted it. And for the first time in my life, something important was about to happen that was completely mine. I hand-delivered the invitations to my mother and sister 4 weeks before the wedding. My mother took hers without looking up from her phone and said, "Okay." My sister held the invitation by the corner like it might contaminate her and said, "I already bought a dress for this. It cost $800. I'm going to look amazing." My mother laughed and said, "You always do, sweetheart." I asked if they were coming, and my mother sighed and said, "Your grandmother asked us to be there, and since she pays for everything we have, I suppose we don't have a choice." That was it. No congratulations, no excitement. Just obligation and resentment wrapped in casual cruelty. The week before the wedding, my grandmother called and said she was coming to stay at the house, her house, for a few days to help with last-minute preparations. My mother was furious about it, complaining to my sister loud enough for my grandmother to hear through the phone. But there was nothing they could do. The house belonged to her, every bill was paid by her, and she had every right to stay there whenever she wanted. My grandmother arrived on Wednesday afternoon with an overnight bag and a box of my favorite cookies. She hugged me in the driveway and said, "Only 3 more days until you marry your person." I helped her carry her things inside while my mother and sister glared at us from the kitchen window. The morning of the wedding, I left the house at 7 in the morning to spend the entire day at a salon downtown. My grandmother came with me and we spent hours getting our hair done, our makeup applied, our nails painted. It felt like a dream, sitting in that chair while someone made me look like the best version of myself. The dress was back at the house, hanging in my old bedroom in a garment bag, protected and ready. My grandmother had helped me steam it the night before, and we'd laid it carefully on the bed with tissue paper underneath. I kept thinking about how I'd feel putting it on in a few hours, how the lace would feel against my skin, how I'd walk down the aisle in something that carried 55 years of love and history. We finished at the salon around 3 in the afternoon. The ceremony wasn't until 6, so we had plenty of time to get back to the house, get dressed, and get to the venue. My grandmother drove us back, talking about how beautiful everything was going to be, how proud she was, how my grandfather would have loved to see this day. We pulled into the driveway, and I felt this surge of excitement mixed with nerves. In 3 hours, I'd be married. In 3 hours, everything would be different. I unlocked the front door, and my grandmother went to the kitchen to make tea while I headed upstairs to my old bedroom to start getting dressed. I opened the door to my bedroom and froze. My mother and sister were standing in the middle of the room, both holding scissors. The floor was covered in pieces of fabric, cream-colored lace torn into strips, buttons scattered everywhere, pieces of the dress that I couldn't even recognize anymore. The garment bag was thrown in the corner, empty. They were laughing about something, their backs to the door, and they didn't hear me come in at first. I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, my brain refusing to connect the pieces of fabric on the floor with the dress that had been perfect and whole just hours ago. Then my sister turned around and saw me. She didn't look guilty or sorry. She looked annoyed that I'd interrupted. My mother turned too, still holding the scissors, and for 1 second nobody said anything. Then I screamed. I don't think I've ever made a sound like that in my entire life. I fell to my knees and grabbed the pieces of lace, trying to find something intact, something salvageable, but it was all destroyed. Every single piece. The bodice was cut into ribbons. The skirt was shredded. The delicate buttons that had been sewn on by hand 55 years ago were pulled off and thrown across the room. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold on to anything. My mother started talking, saying it was an accident, that they didn't mean to, that the scissors just slipped. But they were both holding scissors. Both of them. And the dress hadn't been ripped or torn in one place. It had been systematically destroyed, cut deliberately into pieces too small to repair. I looked up at them from the floor, still holding pieces of lace that used to be my grandmother's wedding dress, and screamed, "You're both holding scissors! How is this an accident?" My sister's face changed completely. She stopped pretending. She dropped the scissors on the floor and said, "You were going to look better than me at your own wedding in some old dress that Grandma never offered to me. How is that fair?" My mother crossed her arms and said, "Your sister deserves the best. She always has. You needed to understand your place, Kate. You're not the special one. You've never been the special one." She said it so calmly, like she was explaining a basic fact about the weather. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't form words. I just knelt there surrounded by the destroyed pieces of something irreplaceable, while my mother and sister stood over me justifying why I deserved it. That's when I heard footsteps in the hallway. My grandmother appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of tea. She looked at me on the floor. She looked at the scissors. She looked at the fabric. The cups fell from her hands and shattered on the hardwood floor, and tea spread across the threshold like a stain. My grandmother walked into the room slowly, like she was moving through water. She bent down and picked up a piece of lace from the floor, holding it between her fingers. Her hands were shaking. Tears started running down her face. But she didn't make a sound. She just stared at that piece of fabric like she was trying to understand how something that had survived 55 years could be destroyed in an afternoon. Then she looked up at my mother and said, in a voice I'd never heard her use before, I raised you alone after your father left. I worked 3 jobs to give you everything. I paid for your education, your home, your life, and you raised a daughter so full of poison that she destroys irreplaceable family treasures and laughs about it. My mother started to speak, but my grandmother held up her hand. Get out of my house. Both of you. Right now. My mother's face went white. My sister started crying immediately, the kind of performative sobbing she'd used to manipulate people her entire life. My grandmother didn't care. She said, this house is mine. The deed is in my name. You've lived here for free for 28 years, and that ends today. You have 1 hour to pack essential items and leave. The monthly payments stop immediately. The utility bills are your problem now. And before we ever speak again, you will repay me for the value of what you destroyed. $50,000 for a dress that can never be replaced. $50,000. The number hit the room like a physical object. My sister fell to her knees and started begging, saying she didn't have that kind of money, that she'd never have that kind of money. My mother tried a different approach, saying my grandmother was being unreasonable, that it was just an old dress, that family was more important than objects. My grandmother looked at her daughter, my mother, and said, family is the reason I'm not calling the police to have you arrested for destruction of property. Family is the only reason you have 1 hour instead of 10 minutes. But family does not mean you get to torture my granddaughter and destroy my memories without consequences. You made your choice. Now live with it. She turned to me and said, Kate, we need to go. Now. She grabbed my arm and pulled me up from the floor. I was still holding pieces of lace, and she gently took them from my hands and said, leave them. We can't fix this. She led me down the stairs while my mother and sister screamed behind us, begging, pleading, promising they'd change. My grandmother didn't turn around. She grabbed her purse and car keys from the kitchen counter and pushed me toward the front door. We got in her car, and she drove faster than I'd ever seen her drive. Straight toward downtown. She pulled up in front of a bridal boutique and said, stay with me. We're going to fix this. We ran inside. Actually ran. And my grandmother explained the situation to the owner, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a measuring tape around her neck. The owner looked at me, looked at my grandmother, and said, let me see what we have. She disappeared into the back room and came out with 3 dresses. The first 2 didn't fit right, but the third one was perfect. It was vintage-inspired, cream-colored, with lace sleeves and a simple silhouette. It wasn't my grandmother's dress. It would never be my grandmother's dress. But it was beautiful, and it fit, and it was mine. We made it to the venue with exactly 8 minutes to spare. I changed in the bathroom while my grandmother explained to my fiancé what had happened. I could hear my fiancé shouting in the hallway, and when I came out in the borrowed dress, she was crying angry tears and saying she was going to call the police. My grandmother calmed her down and said, not today. Today is about Kate, and we're not letting them ruin 1 more second of it. The ceremony started 12 minutes late, but nobody cared. I walked down the aisle holding my grandmother's arm, and when I got to the end, my fiancé was waiting for me with tears streaming down her face. We said our vows in front of 60 people who actually loved us. My mother and sister didn't show up, and honestly, their absence made everything lighter, easier, more real. During the reception, my grandmother gave a speech that made everyone cry. She talked about watching me grow up, about my strength and independence, about how proud she was to call me her granddaughter. People I barely knew came up to me afterward and said they'd never seen a bride look so happy. We danced until midnight. We ate cake and drank champagne and took 1,000 pictures. It wasn't the wedding I'd planned, but it was perfect anyway. And every time I looked around the room, I only saw people who wanted to be there, people who loved me without conditions or comparisons. That night, after everything, I realized that sometimes the worst thing that can happen ends up revealing what matters most. 3 weeks after the wedding, my grandmother made good on every single word she'd said. My mother and sister were living with my mother's sister in a 1-bedroom apartment across town, sharing a pull-out couch in the living room. My grandmother transferred the house deed officially into my name and my wife's name. My wife. I was still getting used to saying that. The monthly payments stopped. The utilities were shut off and transferred out of my grandmother's name. After decades of never working, my mother and sister finally had to get jobs. My mother got a job as a cashier at a grocery store. My sister got hired as a sales associate at a clothing store in the mall. They both hated it. I know because my aunt told my grandmother, who told me. They complained constantly about standing all day, about dealing with customers, about how unfair it was that they had to work while I got to live in a house for free. Except it wasn't free. My wife and I paid the utilities. We bought groceries, we maintained the property, we turned my old bedroom into a home office. We painted the living room. We planted flowers in the front yard. It became ours in a way it had never been theirs, because we took care of it and appreciated it and didn't take it for granted. My grandmother visited every Sunday for dinner. We'd cook together, the three of us, and sit around the table talking about our weeks. My grandmother told stories about my grandfather, about their wedding day 55 years ago, about the dress that no longer existed except in photographs and memories. She never cried about it in front of me, but sometimes I'd catch her staring at the empty space in her closet where the garment bag used to hang, and I knew she was mourning something irreplaceable. 2 months after the wedding, my mother and sister showed up at the house. I was home alone, working on my laptop in the living room, when I heard knocking on the door. I looked through the window and saw them standing on the porch. My mother looked exhausted, her hair grayer than I remembered, her face drawn and thin. My sister had gained weight and looked miserable, her expensive clothes replaced with clearance rack basics. They were both crying before I even opened the door. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob, debating whether to open it at all, and finally decided I needed to hear what they had to say. I opened the door but didn't invite them inside. My mother immediately started talking, saying she was sorry, that they'd made a terrible mistake, that they wanted to come home. My sister was sobbing, saying she'd learned her lesson, that working was horrible and she couldn't do it anymore, that she understood now how hard life was. My mother said they'd been punished enough, that 2 months of suffering should be sufficient, that family forgives family. She said I was living in her house, not her house, my house, and that I owed it to her to let them come back. My sister said she'd be nicer to me, that we could start over, that she'd even help plan a vow renewal ceremony to make up for ruining my wedding. I stood there listening to them beg, and all I could see was my bedroom floor covered in pieces of lace. All I could hear was my sister saying I wasn't supposed to look better than her. All I could feel was my mother's voice explaining my place in the family hierarchy. I thought about my grandmother holding that scrap of fabric between her trembling fingers. I thought about the 55 years of history that they'd destroyed in less than an hour because they couldn't stand to see me happy. I looked at my mother, then at my sister, and I said, "No." My sister's face changed immediately. The tears stopped. She said, "What do you mean, no?" I said, "I mean no. You're not moving back in. You're not coming home. This is my home now, and you're not welcome here." My mother stepped forward and said, "You can't do this. I'm your mother." I said, "You stopped being my mother a long time ago. You just didn't notice because I was still playing the role of the daughter who didn't matter." My sister started screaming, calling me selfish and cruel, and saying I was destroying the family. I said, "You destroyed Grandma's wedding dress. You destroyed my wedding day. You destroyed any chance we had at a relationship. That's on you, not me." My mother tried one more time. She said, "If you do this, we'll have nothing. We'll lose everything." I said, "Good. Maybe you'll finally understand what it feels like to not be handed everything without working for it." Then I stepped back inside and closed the door. I locked it while they pounded on it from the other side, yelling and crying and threatening. I walked away from the door, sat down on my couch, and called my grandmother. I told her what happened, and she said, "I'm proud of you." That was all I needed to hear. They didn't come back after that. I heard through my aunt that they were still working their retail jobs, still living in the one-bedroom apartment, still complaining about how unfair their lives had become. My grandmother never reinstated their monthly payments. She never paid their bills again. She never offered them the house back. The $50,000 debt remained unpaid and unforgiven, hanging over their heads like a storm cloud that would never clear. Sometimes my aunt would call my grandmother and beg her to reconsider, saying my mother and sister were suffering, that they'd learned their lesson. My grandmother would listen politely and then say, "They destroyed something priceless because they couldn't stand to see Kate happy. Until they understand why that's unforgivable, nothing changes." My wife and I settled into our life in the house. We adopted a dog from the shelter, a mutt with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down. We hosted Thanksgiving dinner for the first time, and my grandmother brought her famous sweet potato casserole. We turned the spare bedroom into a nursery, not because we were having a baby yet, but because we wanted to be ready when the time came. We painted the walls soft yellow and built a bookshelf that my wife installed slightly crooked but refused to let me fix because she said it had character. The house filled up with our life, our choices, our love, and every single day I walked through those rooms, I felt grateful for the door I'd closed and the life I'd chosen instead. 6 months after the wedding, I was cleaning out the closet in my old bedroom and found a small box shoved in the back corner. Inside were photographs from my childhood. Most of them were of my sister, birthday parties, school plays, family dinners where she sat at the center of every frame. But at the bottom of the box, I found one picture of my grandmother and me. I was maybe 7 years old, sitting on her lap in her kitchen, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, it said, "My special girl." I put that picture in a frame and hung it in the hallway right next to my wedding photo. Every time I walked past it, I remembered that someone had always seen me, even when everyone else looked right through me. My grandmother started having dinner with us twice a week instead of just Sundays. She'd show up with ingredients for whatever recipe she wanted to teach us, and we'd spend hours in the kitchen making elaborate meals that we'd eat together at the table. She taught me how to make my grandfather's favorite pot roast. She taught my wife how to make the cookies she'd baked for me every Christmas. She told stories about her marriage, about the fights they had and the love they shared, about how nothing is perfect, but some things are worth fighting for. She never mentioned my mother unless I brought her up first, and even then she'd only say, "Some people never learn that love isn't something you can take for granted." One night, almost a year after the wedding, my wife and I were lying in bed in our house. In our room, under blankets we'd picked out together. She turned to me and said, "Do you ever regret closing the door on them?" I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the little girl who'd spent her entire childhood begging for attention that never came. I thought about the teenager who'd worked her first job while her sister slept until noon. I thought about the woman who'd stood in her childhood bedroom surrounded by the shredded pieces of something irreplaceable while her mother explained why she deserved it. Then I said, "No, I don't regret it at all." The house that used to feel like a prison became a sanctuary. The family that used to drain me became a choice I made every day. My wife, my grandmother, the people who saw me and valued me and chose me back. My mother and sister remained in their one-bedroom apartment, working their jobs, living their consequences. I heard my mother got written up at work for being rude to customers. I heard my sister got into a screaming match with her manager over her schedule. They were unraveling in real time, facing the reality that nobody was going to rescue them, that the safety net they'd taken for granted for 30 years was gone and never coming back. Part of me felt guilty about their situation, but a bigger part of me remembered the sound of scissors cutting through lace and the laughter that followed, and the guilt disappeared. My grandmother's health started declining about 14 months after the wedding. Nothing dramatic, just the slow fade that comes with being in your 80s. She got tired more easily. She needed help carrying groceries. She started forgetting small things, like where she'd put her keys or what day of the week it was. My wife and I had her move in with us. We gave her the master bedroom because it had the attached bathroom and was easier for her to navigate. We took the smaller bedroom and didn't think twice about it. She tried to protest, saying she didn't want to be a burden, and I told her she'd spent my entire life making sure I never felt like a burden, and it was my turn to return the favor. Having her live with us was the best decision we ever made. She'd sit in the kitchen while I made breakfast and tell me stories about my grandfather. She'd watch game shows in the afternoon and yell at the contestants when they gave wrong answers. She'd help fold laundry and give unsolicited advice about my marriage that was always surprisingly accurate. My wife adored her, and the feeling was mutual. They'd gang up on me during card games and cheat blatantly while insisting they were just lucky. The house felt full in a way it never had before, full of laughter and love and the kind of family I'd always wanted but never thought I'd have. My mother called once during this time. I don't know how she got my number, probably from my aunt. She didn't apologize. She didn't ask how I was doing. She said, "I heard Grandma moved in with you. That's not fair. She's my mother." I said, "She's also the person whose wedding dress you destroyed because you couldn't stand to see me happy. So no, you don't get access to her just because you share DNA." She said, "You're keeping her away from me." I said, "No, your choices kept her away from you. There's a difference." She hung up on me, and I blocked the number immediately after. I told my grandmother about the call, and she patted my hand and said, "You did the right thing." Life continued. Seasons changed. My wife got promoted at work. I got a raise and started managing a small team at my company. We took my grandmother to the beach for a weekend and watched her sit in a chair with her feet in the sand, smiling at the ocean like she was 20 years old again. We celebrated her 83rd birthday with a small party in our backyard, just the three of us and a few of her friends from her book club. She blew out the candles on her cake and said, "This is the happiest I've been in years." I believed her. My sister tried to show up at the house one more time, about 18 months after I'd closed the door on them the first time. I was leaving for work in the morning, and she was sitting on the porch steps waiting for me. She looked terrible, exhausted, defeated, like life had beaten her down and she didn't know how to get back up. She said, "Can we talk?" I said, No. She said, please. I just need 5 minutes. I said, you had 28 years. You used them to treat me like I didn't matter. You don't get 5 more minutes. She started crying and said, I'm sorry. I said, I don't care. Then I got in my car and drove away, watching her in my rearview mirror until she disappeared. That night, I told my wife and grandmother what happened. My wife asked if I felt bad about it, and I said, no, I feel free. My grandmother smiled and said, good, you should. We had dinner together like always, the 3 of us around the table, talking about our days and making plans for the weekend. This was my family now. Not the people who shared my DNA and made me feel worthless for 30 years. This was real family. People who chose each other, who showed up, who protected each other, who didn't weaponize love or use it as a bargaining chip. This was what I'd been looking for my entire life, and I'd found it by finally closing the door on the people who never deserved to walk through it in the first place. My grandmother lived with us for another 3 years. She was there when my wife and I finally decided to start trying for a baby. She was there when we found out we were pregnant. She was there when we brought our daughter home from the hospital. And she held that baby with tears streaming down her face and said, she's perfect, just like her mother. She helped us through the sleepless nights and the overwhelming terror of being new parents. She rocked our daughter to sleep and sang old lullabies that I'd never heard before, but that felt familiar anyway, like they'd been passed down through generations of women in my family who actually knew how to love. My daughter's first word was gamma, which was close enough to grandma that we all counted it. My grandmother cried when it happened, and later that night she told me, I got it right this time. I raised your mother, and I made mistakes that turned her into someone cruel. But I helped raise you, and you turned into someone strong and kind. And now you're raising this little girl, and she's going to be extraordinary. I told her she didn't make mistakes with my mother. My mother made her own choices, but I understood what she meant. She'd gotten a second chance at being present in a grandchild's life, and she wasn't going to waste it. She passed away quietly one Tuesday morning in her sleep, 3 months after my daughter's 2nd birthday. We found her in her bed, peaceful, like she'd just decided she was ready to go. The funeral was small. My wife and I, our daughter, my grandmother's book club friends, a few neighbors who'd known her for decades. My mother and sister showed up uninvited and tried to sit in the front row. I asked them to leave. They refused. I called the funeral director and he escorted them out while they screamed about how I was a terrible daughter and they had a right to be there. I didn't care. Even at her funeral, they were trying to make it about themselves, trying to claim grief they hadn't earned. They'd lost her years ago when they destroyed something precious and laughed about it. They didn't get to mourn her now. My grandmother left everything to me in her will. Her savings, her investments, her jewelry, everything. My mother tried to contest it, arguing that she was the daughter and deserved at least half. The lawyer shut that down immediately with documentation of the $50,000 debt that had never been repaid, and a letter my grandmother had written specifically for this purpose. In the letter, she explained exactly why she was leaving everything to me, because I was the only one who'd ever valued her for more than what she could provide financially, because I was the only one who'd shown up without expectations or demands, because I was the granddaughter who'd loved her without conditions. The letter ended with, Kate is the family I chose. The rest of them are just people I used to know. My mother and sister disappeared after that. I heard they moved to a different state, still working retail, still barely making ends meet. My aunt stopped calling to advocate for them. I think even she realized that some bridges burn for good reasons and shouldn't be rebuilt. My wife and I used part of my grandmother's inheritance to set up a college fund for our daughter. We used another part to finally take that trip to Europe we'd been talking about for years. We used the rest to make sure we'd never have to worry about money the way my mother and sister were worrying about it now, working jobs they hated just to survive. Our daughter is 7 years old now. She's smart and funny and occasionally a little too honest in ways that make me laugh and cringe simultaneously. She doesn't know my mother or sister. She's never met them. When she asks about family, I tell her about her gamma, about the woman who taught me what real love looks like. I show her the picture of my grandmother and me in the kitchen, both of us laughing, and I tell her that's what family is supposed to feel like. I tell her about the wedding dress that was destroyed, and the wedding that happened anyway, and how sometimes the worst moments lead to the best decisions. She asked me once when she was 6 why she didn't have any aunts or uncles or other grandparents. I told her that family isn't about who you're related to. It's about who shows up, who stays, who protects you when you need protection. I told her that some people are connected by blood but not by love, and love is what matters. She thought about it for a minute and then said, "So our family is small but good?" I said, "Exactly." She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and went back to coloring a picture of our dog. My wife and I still live in the house. We've made it completely ours now. New furniture, new paint, renovated kitchen, a backyard playground for our daughter. Sometimes I walk through the rooms and think about how different my life could have been if I'd opened that door when my mother and sister came begging. If I'd let guilt override self-preservation. If I'd chosen to keep toxic people in my life just because they were related to me. But I didn't. I chose myself. I chose peace. I chose the family I built instead of the family I was born into. And every single day, I know I made the right choice. The house that used to represent everything wrong with my childhood now represents everything right with my life. My daughter runs through the hallways that I used to walk through feeling invisible. My wife cooks in the kitchen where my mother used to ignore me. We have family dinners in the dining room where I used to sit in silence while my sister received all the attention. But none of those old ghosts haunt this place anymore, because we've filled it with new memories, better memories, the kind that don't leave scars. Sometimes late at night when everyone else is asleep, I think about my grandmother's wedding dress. I think about how it survived 55 years, stored carefully, preserved perfectly, waiting for the right moment and the right person. I think about how it was destroyed in less than an hour by people who couldn't stand to see me happy. And I think about how that destruction, as devastating as it was in the moment, freed me from years of trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. That dress was beautiful, and losing it broke my heart. But losing it also saved my life in a way I didn't understand until years later. I have one picture from my wedding day. My wife and I standing together, my arms around her waist, both of us laughing at something someone said off camera. I'm wearing the borrowed dress from the boutique, the one that saved the day but wasn't my grandmother's. But when I look at that picture, I don't see what I lost. I see what I gained. A partner who loves me unconditionally, a family built on respect and genuine affection, a life that belongs entirely to me. That picture sits on our mantle, right next to the framed photo of my grandmother and me in her kitchen. Two moments, decades apart, both representing the same thing: being seen, being valued, being loved for exactly who I am. My mother and sister made their choices. They chose jealousy over joy, cruelty over kindness, destruction over celebration. They chose to hurt me because they couldn't handle me being happy. And I chose to walk away from them permanently, to close the door and lock it and never look back. Some people might think that makes me cold or unforgiving. Some people might say family deserves second chances. But those people weren't there when I knelt on my bedroom floor surrounded by pieces of irreplaceable lace while my mother explained my place in the hierarchy. Those people didn't hear the laughter that followed the destruction. Those people don't get to tell me what forgiveness should look like. I forgave them in the sense that I stopped letting their actions control my emotional state. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come or change that would never happen. I stopped hoping they'd suddenly realize what they'd done and become different people. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean letting them back into my life. It doesn't mean pretending the past didn't happen, or that their choices didn't have consequences. Forgiveness, for me, meant accepting that they are who they are, and choosing to build my life without them in it. That's not cruelty. That's survival. My daughter will grow up knowing she's loved, valued, and seen. She'll never wonder if she matters or if she's second best. She'll never stand in her sister's shadow because she doesn't have a sister. And if she did, I'd make damn sure both of them felt equally important. She'll never experience the particular pain of having a parent who dismisses her or looks right through her. And if anyone ever tries to treat her the way my mother and sister treated me, she'll have parents who will protect her fiercely and teach her that walking away from toxicity is strength, not weakness. This is my life now. This is the family I chose. This is the peace I fought for and earned and protect every single day. The door I closed 7 years ago stayed closed. The people on the other side of it are living their consequences, and I'm living my best life without them. My grandmother would be proud. My daughter is happy. My wife and I are building something beautiful in the house that used to feel like a prison, but now feels like home. And every single morning when I wake up, I'm grateful for the moment I looked at my mother and sister begging on my doorstep and said the word that changed everything. No. That no was the beginning of everything good in my life. The moment I stopped being the second choice and became just Kate, building a life that protected my peace instead of preserving relationships that had always been one-sided. I don't hate my mother and sister. Honestly, I don't feel much of anything for them anymore. They're just people I used to know, people who made choices that revealed who they really were, people I decided weren't worth the emotional energy required to maintain a relationship. They showed me exactly who they were on what should have been one of the happiest days of my life. And I believed them. That's not a tragedy. That's clarity. And clarity, even when it hurts, is always better than living in denial. The last time I thought about them seriously, really sat down and considered their situation, was about a year ago. My daughter asked me why some kids at school have big families with lots of aunts and uncles and cousins, and we just have us. I explained that families come in all sizes, and small families can be just as full of love as big ones. She accepted that easily, the way kids do. But later that night, after she was asleep, I thought about my mother and sister working their retail jobs, living their small lives, paying for decades of cruelty and laziness with daily doses of reality. I wondered if they ever thought about the dress they destroyed. I wondered if they ever connected their current situation with that moment of vindictive jealousy. I wondered if they'd learned anything at all. Then I realized I didn't actually care about the answers to those questions, and I went to bed. That's what freedom feels like. Not the dramatic moment of slamming a door or the satisfying speech about consequences. Freedom is waking up every day and genuinely not caring what happens to the people who spent decades making you feel worthless. Freedom is building a life so full and good that you forget to think about them for weeks at a time. Freedom is looking at your daughter playing in the backyard and realizing she'll never know the particular kind of pain you grew up with, because you broke the cycle before it could reach her. That's victory. That's the revenge that actually matters. Not their suffering, but your joy. Not their punishment, but your peace. My grandmother knew that. In her final years, living in our house, she never once mentioned my mother except to say she'd made her choices and now had to live with them. She focused entirely on the family in front of her, me, my wife, our daughter. She invested her time and love and energy in relationships that gave back, that nourished her, that made her last years joyful, instead of burdened by obligation to people who'd never appreciated her. She taught me through example that you don't owe anyone your life just because they're related to you. You owe yourself peace, happiness, and the courage to walk away from anything that threatens those things. I carry that lesson with me every single day. When I'm at work dealing with difficult colleagues, when I'm parenting through tough moments with my daughter, when I'm navigating the normal conflicts and frustrations of marriage and life and bills and stress, I remember that I have the right to protect my peace. I have the right to set boundaries. I have the right to say no to people, situations, and relationships that take more than they give. That lesson, learned through the painful experience of cutting off my mother and sister, has made me stronger in every area of my life. The worst thing that ever happened to me became the foundation for the best decisions I ever made. So no, I don't regret closing the door. I don't regret refusing to open it when they came back begging. I don't regret building a life that doesn't include them. They had 28 years to treat me like I mattered, and they chose not to. They had one afternoon to not destroy something irreplaceable out of jealousy, and they couldn't manage it. They had multiple opportunities to genuinely apologize and change, and they spent those opportunities manipulating and making excuses instead. They showed me who they were repeatedly, consistently, without ambiguity. And I finally believed them and acted accordingly. This is what winning looks like. Not money or status or revenge, but peace. A quiet house filled with people who love each other. A daughter who feels valued. A marriage built on respect and genuine partnership. A life free from toxicity and game playing and constant comparisons. This is the life I chose when I closed that door. And I'd choose it again every single time. My mother and sister got what they deserved. Each other, a cramped apartment, jobs they hate, and the knowledge that they destroyed their own family through their own actions. I got what I deserved too. A real family. A beautiful home, and the freedom to live without their poison. In the end, everyone got exactly what they earned. And every single day I wake up in my house, kiss my wife, hug my daughter, and feel grateful for the strength it took to say no to the people who never deserved my yes. That's my story. That's my truth. That's the life I built from the ashes of a destroyed wedding dress and a childhood spent overlooked. And I wouldn't change a single thing about it, because every painful moment led me exactly where I needed to be. Free, loved, and finally visible to the people who actually matter.